year was 1942. The Japanese had just bombed Pearl Harbor. And above the skies of Los Angeles was one of the largest UFO sightings of all time. We'll provide you the evidence. Different points of view. You decide what is true, what is false, and what is misinformation.
Kane writes 6 Things You Didn't Know About the Real Battle of Los Angeles. Also known as the Great Los Angeles Air Raid, the event took place in the wee hours of February 25th, 1942, just over 3 months after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and brought the United States into World War II. Air raid sirens began going off as anti-aircraft guns and searchlights began combining the skies over LA as they hunted for the rumored enemy aircraft, but none were spotted or shot down. The incident was covered extensively by local and national press, but no one could give a satisfactory explanation of what precipitated the alarm. While the military eventually attributed the incident to war nerves and the sighting of an errant weather balloon, ufologists have speculated for years that our guns were actually firing at extraterrestrial spaceships. We decided to take a look into the Battle of Los Angeles a little more and come up with these fascinating bits of info. The real battle was the day before. While there was no conclusive proof that the Japanese or anyone else attacked Los Angeles on February 25th, 1942, Santa Barbara, California, just 2 hours up the road, was the subject of a Japanese raid just 2 days earlier. A Japanese sub prowling the waters off of California coast fired several shells at the targets in the area, causing minimal damage, but initiating the invasion scare that followed. The panic in Los Angeles was caused when a number of witnesses reportedly sighted a large round object in the skies over Culver City and Santa Monica, both neighborhoods on the west side of town and closer to the Pacific Ocean. The object was barraged with more than 1,400 shells from anti-aircraft guns with no visible effect, until it eventually drifted leisurely south towards Long Beach and vanished from view. Most reports described it as a pale orange in color and glowing. There were casualties. The Battle of Los Angeles did in fact claim 6 lives. 3 civilians were killed directly by friendly fire, while 3 others suffered heart attacks during the hour-long siege. A number of buildings were also damaged by our own anti-aircraft guns. Other theories. Shortly after the alarm, speculation ran rampant as to its cause. Some people suggested that the Japanese were launching planes from a secret base in Mexico, while others theorized that they had developed a submarine capable of carrying aircraft. It was even suggested that the event had been staged in order to convince defense companies located near the coast to move their operations further inland. The military could not get its story straight. While the Army's Western Defense Command in San Francisco initially attributed the incident to unidentified planes over Southern California, the Secretary of the Navy said the event was the result of war nerves and a false alarm. It wasn't until 1983, more than 40 years later, that the military concluded that the incident was probably caused by a drifting weather balloon. The mystery remains, although many eyewitnesses report seeing a single large unidentified object over LA. A number of others also report spotting anywhere from 25 to 200 planes swarming over the metropolitan area. But not a single bomb was dropped, and not a single enemy fighter was brought down. The round object itself was never recovered or seen again. Despite the official explanation, no real answer to what or who staged the Battle of Los Angeles has ever been found. According to the website militarymuseum.org, the page containing California and the Second World War, the Battle of Los Angeles. The official military report on this incident was prepared by Wesley Frank Craven, James Lee Catt in Washington, D.C. During the night of February 24th through the morning of the 25th of February, 1942, unidentified objects caused a succession of alert in Southern California. On the 24th, a warning issue by the Naval Intelligence indicated that an attack could be expected within 10 hours. That evening, a large number of flares and blinking lights were reported from the vicinity of the defense plants. An alert called at 7:18 p.m. was lifted at 10:23 p.m. and the tension temporarily relaxed. But in the early morning of the 25th, renewed activity began. Radars picked up an unidentified object 120 miles west of Los Angeles. Anti-aircraft batteries were alerted at 2:15 a.m. and were put on green alert, which means ready to fire. A few minutes later, the AAF kept its pursuit planes on the ground, preferring to await indications of the scale and the direction of any attack before committing its limited fighter force. Radars tracked the approaching target to within a few miles of the coast, and at 2:21 the regional control ordered a blackout. Therefore, the information center was flooded with reports of enemy planes, even though the mysterious object tracked from the sea seems to have vanished. At 2:43, planes were reported near Long Beach, and a few minutes later, a Coast Artillery colonel spotted about 25 planes at 1,200 feet over Los Angeles. At 3:06 a.m., a balloon carrying a red flare was seen over Santa Monica, and 4 batteries of anti-aircraft artillery opened fire, whereupon the air over Los Angeles erupted like a volcano. From this point on, reports were hopelessly at variance. Probably much of the confusion came from the fact that the anti-aircraft bursts caught by the searchlights were themselves mistaken for enemy planes. In any case, the next 3 hours produced some of the most imaginative reporting of the war. Swarms of planes or sometimes balloons of all possible size, numbering from 1 to several hundred, traveling at altitudes which ranged from a few thousand feet to more than 20,000 feet, and flying at speeds which were said to have varied from very slow to over 200 miles per hour, were observed to parade across the skies. These mysterious forces dropped no bombs, despite the fact that 1,440 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition were directed against them, suffered no losses. There were reports, to be sure, that 4 enemy planes had been shot down, and 1 was supposed to have landed in flames at the Hollywood intersection. Residents in a 40-mile arc along the coast watched from hills and rooftops as the play of guns and searchlights provided the first real drama of the war for the citizens of the mainland. The dawn, which ended the shooting and the fantasy, also proved that the only damage which resulted to the city was such as it had been caused by the excitement. There was at least 1 death from heart failure, by traffic accidents in the blackout streets, or by fragments of the artillery barrage. Attempts to arrive at an explanation of the incident quickly became involved and mysterious as the battle itself. The Navy immediately insisted that there was no evidence of the presence of enemy planes, and the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, announced at a press conference on February 25th that the raid was just a false alarm. At the same conference, he admitted that the attacks were always probable and indicated that industries located along the coast ought to be moved inland. The Army had a hard time of making up its mind on the cause of the alert. A report to Washington made by the Western Defense Command shortly after the raid had ended, indicating that the credibility of the reports of the attack had begun to be shaken before the blackout was lifted. This message preceded that the developments would prove that the most prevalent reports had been greatly exaggerated. The 4th Air Force had indicated its belief that there were no planes over Los Angeles, but the Army did not publish these initial concerns. Instead, it waited a day until after a thorough examination of witnesses had been finished. On the basis of these hearings, local commanders altered their verdict and indicated as a belief that from 1 to 5 unidentified planes had been over Los Angeles. Secretary Stimson announced this conclusion as the War Department's version of the incident, and he advanced 2 theories to the account of the mysterious aircraft. Either they were commercial planes operated by the enemy from secret fields in California or Mexico, or they were light planes launched from Japanese submarines. In either case, the enemy's purpose must have been to locate the anti-aircraft defenses in the area or to deliver a blow at civilian morale. The divergence of views between the War and the Navy departments, and the unsatisfying conjectures advanced by the Army to explain the affair, touched off a vigorous public discussion. The Los Angeles Times, in the first page editorial on the 26th of February, announced that the considerable public excitement and confusion caused by the alert, as well as spectacular official accompaniments, demanded a careful explanation. Fears were expressed at least a few phony raids undermined the confidence of the civilian volunteers in the aircraft warning services. In Congress, Representative Leland Ford wanted to know whether the incident was a practice raid or a raid to throw scare into 2 million people, or a mistaken identity raid, or a raid that had taken away Southern California's war industries. Wendell Weeke, speaking in Los Angeles on the 26th of February, assured Californians on the basis of his experiences in England that when a real air raid begins, you won't have to argue about it, you'll just know it. He conceded that the military authorities had been correct in calling the precautionary alerts, but deplored the lack of agreement between the Army and Navy. A strong editorial in the Washington Post on the 27th of February called the handling of the Los Angeles episode a recipe for jitters, and censored the military authorities for what it calls stubborn silence. The editorial suggested that the Army's theory that the commercial planes might have caused an alert explains everything except for where the planes came from, whether they were going, and why no American planes were sent in pursuit of them. The New York Times on the 28th of February expressed a belief that the more the incident was studied, the more incredible it became. If the batteries were firing at nothing at all, as Secretary Knox implies, it is a sign of expensive incompetence and jitters. If the batteries were firing on real planes, some of them as low as 9,000 feet, as the Secretary Stimson declares, why were they completely ineffective? Why did no American planes go up to engage them, or even to identify them? What would have happened if this had been a real air raid? These questions were appropriate, but the War Department, to have answered them in full frankness, would have involved an even more complete revelation of the weakness of our air defenses. At the end of the war, the Japanese stated that they did not send planes over the area at the time of the alert, although submarine-launched aircraft were subsequently used over Seattle. A careful study of the evidence suggests that meteorological balloons known to have been released over Los Angeles may have well caused the initial alarm. This theory is supported by the fact that the anti-aircraft units were officially criticized for having wasted ammunition on targets which moved too slowly to have been airplanes. After the firing started, careful observation was difficult because of the drifting smoke from the shell bursts. The acting commander of the anti-aircraft artillery barrage in the area testified that he had first been convinced that he had seen 15 planes in the air, but had quickly decided that he was seeing smoke. Competent correspondents like Ernie Pyle and Bill Henry witnessed the shootings and wrote that they were never able to make out an airplane. It is hard to see in any event what enemy purpose would have been served by an attack in which no bombs were dropped, unless perhaps, as Mr. Stimson suggested, the purpose had been reconnaissance. UFO researcher Stephen Lacey submitted a report to Rense.com after analyzing the photographic evidence from the Battle of LA that there's no doubt that this was a UFO. He used the Photoshop to clear up some of the images originally taken in 1942. His report reads, "The Battle of LA UFO. Stunning new photo enhancements. Story and picture enhancements by Stephen Lacey. August 31st, 2005. An alien aircraft flew over Los Angeles County in 1942, and the pictures below prove it. Something very odd happened in the early morning hours of February 25th, 1942. An aircraft flew over LA County that sparked an air raid alert. Searchlights and guns were locked onto the aircraft for about an hour. The alert was unlike any other. We've all seen images of the military action in Iraq. Pictures of batteries of anti-aircraft guns firing in what looks like random patterns are familiar to most of us. The picture below appears in the LA Times story about the Battle of LA. It clearly shows a nighttime defense response to an air raid, but the situation is very different than in Iraq. The men firing the guns weren't desperately searching the skies to find the target. They clearly had a focus for their efforts. This picture is the most convincing piece of evidence I've seen of an alien aircraft. With little effort using Adobe Photoshop, I was able to clear up the images into something clearly showing a classic saucer-shaped craft right in the center of where all the searchlights are aimed. I enlarged the picture and adjusted the brightness and contrast using the levels tool. The picture clearly shows a saucer-shaped craft in the area I've highlighted. The area outside my highlight appears to be clouds of smoke from several large explosions being illuminated by the lights. Look closely at the explosions. They don't look like they're actually coming in contact with the craft. Witnesses told LA Times reporters that the bombs exploded in rings around the craft. Could it be that the craft had shields that are very similar to the shields used by the imaginary craft of Star Trek? The Battle of LA makes a very convincing argument for the persistence of alien aircraft in our skies. The fact that something not of this earth flew slowly over LA County is very clear. There were hundreds of thousands of witnesses to the craft as it traveled apparently without being in any hurry, while our military tried very hard to knock it out of the sky. Once the craft had slowly traveled out of range of our guns, the battle was over. Since Pearl Harbor had happened only a few months before, it was easy to believe that the Japanese had made the flight. Now that theory simply doesn't make any sense. If the Japanese had aircraft that were immune to our anti-aircraft guns, then the war would have taken a very different path. Even 60 years later, no country on Earth has aircraft that can continue to fly without any apparent damage after being hit with even one aircraft shell. The aircraft flew over LA County that night, had to have been an alien aircraft. The aircraft wasn't hostile. If the pilots of the craft had wanted to hurt somebody, they certainly had the chance. I can't say whether the craft was armed, but if humans had designed a craft that could take such punishment, they would have designed it to be able to carry weapons. There wasn't any mention about the craft doing anything hostile in any of the news stories I read. It didn't drop any bombs, and it didn't fire back at the gun emplacements. Why would anyone, human or alien, make such a flight? I see this flight as a kind of show of force without using force. The craft flew very slowly along without taking any evasive action as our military threw everything it could at it. If this was an intelligently controlled vehicle, then there is no way that the pilots didn't notice the barrage of shells that were being directed at their craft. It's obvious that they weren't concerned that the craft would be harmed. The craft withstood the best we could do to it without showing any damage. It clearly shows that the technology used to manufacture this craft is far superior to ours. What happened suggests intent. They ignored the provocation of our attempts to destroy them. It might have been done as a statement. I think that the pilots of the craft were trying to say we couldn't hurt them and that we shouldn't be afraid of them. The Battle of LA happened long before the idea that an unidentified flying object might be an alien aircraft was widespread. The government simply said that the craft that they were shooting at was unidentified. They let the public assume that the craft had been Japanese. I wonder how many people even questioned the idea that the craft must be Japanese. I wonder what would have happened if they had brought the ship down. The government had had enough trouble covering up what happened at Roswell. I don't think they would have been able to cover up a crashed alien craft the size of an apartment building in the middle of the city of LA. I wonder what would happen if our government started shooting at an unidentified craft over a city today. What if it happened exactly the same way? The craft flies slowly over a city without firing a shot while we throw everything we have at it? Can you imagine the live news coverage of the event being broadcast around the world? I wonder how many people would immediately conclude that the unidentified craft was an aircraft manufactured by beings not of this earth. Can you imagine how fast the lid of secrecy would try to come down on the story? Alien aircrafts are flying in our skies. There is no doubt in my mind that one flew over LA County on a clear, cold night 60 years ago.
I hope we provided you with enough information to make an informed decision. Have a nice day.